This time I have the honor of introducing the Vice Chair of Programs for the Ann Arbor Democratic Party and Club, and that is Ingrid Ault. Ingrid is a lifelong resident of Ann Arbor in Washtenaw County. She is a product of the schools here in the county and in Ann Arbor, and she also graduated from EMU. And she has experience in politics. She has experience in serving on commissions in city government, and also a small business person. She was one of the first people to say, think local. So this morning, she is going to talk about voter turnout in Ann Arbor specifically. And so I am proud to introduce Ingrid. Ingrid, please come on.
Thanks, Mary. Pleased to be here today. In the words of Lavora, how are we going to win some damn elections? The best way to do that, and next slide, please, is by understanding what we just went through. So I'm going to talk about voter participation in the 2020 election. As Mary said, I'm Ingrid Ault, and all the data that we're going to see, and there's going to be quite a bit, was sourced from Washtenaw County Clerk's Office and the U.S. Census Bureau. Next slide, please. What you're looking at here is the historical participation from the last 4 elections. And you can see that when you look at the data from 2020 to 2008 in the Obama election, we had 68.77 participation. And in the 2020 election, we had 68.35 participation. So we haven't quite reached where we did in 2008 when Obama ran. So, and it took us a long time to build quite back up to that. So we've got some work to do to maintain that. But the good news is we're back up to where we were. Next slide, please. I like this slide because it shows you the context of what I'm going to discuss over the next few slides. For your voter turnout, green shows your high participation, red shows your low participation. Keep that in mind as we move through the slides. Blue on the voter affiliation shows who voted for Biden. Darker color is higher concentration. And then orange shows who voted for the other guy. Next slide, please. So townships show with high participation, and this is an interesting correlation here because we see that those with low population rates, and you see those in the parentheses, had a very high turnout. So for example, the highest voter turnout happened in York. And unfortunately, if you're looking at your screen, you're probably losing part of the map. But if you look at one in the lower southeast quadrant, that's York Township, and the plus 14.7, that indicates that they voted for Trump. And those other numbers correlate with all of the other townships. And these all had 80 or higher voter participation. So you can see that these smaller townships all had very high participation rates. So smaller communities participate at high levels. Next slide, please. So in other townships, we saw, these are the other 9 townships. They also had participation rates at a different level. Specifically, the ones I want to point out here are number 6 and number 9, which is Ypsilanti Township and Pittsfield Township, which have much higher density levels, and those had lower participation rates. And Pittsfield Township, which is number 9, had the lowest participation rate in our county at 58%. Next slide. The good news is that if you live in a city, you vote Democratic always. And your participation rates vary quite a bit. But again, what we see are smaller communities always have higher participation rates. So the cities of Dexter, Saline, Chelsea, and Milan all had higher participation rates the cities of Ypsilanti, which are, well, Ypsilanti's a little bit larger than the other cities by about 3 times. And then of course, the city of Ann Arbor is much, much larger, but they both had very low participation rates, just a little bit higher than Pittsfield. Next slide. What I did look at was the percentage of participation by ward in Ann Arbor. And you can see that in Ann Arbor, the participation rate is actually pretty poor. When you look at Ward 1, 54%. I mean, those are registered voters. That's really a poor turnout. It was kind of shocking, but there you have it. 5 had the best participation rate of 65.4%. Now, why is that? Maybe it's the local organizer aspect that Lavore mentioned. You know, one of the things that Ward 5 does is they have the Snow Buddy and they have Water Hill, and maybe there's more of a community aspect that feels in there. I don't know. One of the things that I thought of. Next slide. So when we look at ward comparisons over the 2008 and 2020 in Ward 1, we saw very little movement, and we saw very little differentiation between what happened between both elections. There was not much movement in Ann Arbor. We're pretty stagnant. We haven't changed. What we did see in Ypsilanti, though, was a difference between the 2008 and 2020 election, almost a 3.5 drop. So I think that's really interesting. And I think that means we have some work to do in Ypsilanti for sure. But the one thing that was really interesting was in Ward 1, there was an uptick, a huge uptick. And maybe that is a correlation with Lois Richardson, and that's where she sits, who's the current mayor of Ypsilanti. So maybe she had an influence in the election there. So I thought that was interesting. Next slide. So our analysis of what happened during the election, what does all of this mean? It took us 12 years to regain what work we did in 2008 to where we are now. Communities with smaller populations tend to vote higher, which means we really need to think about what happens in cities and of larger size, and how do we make organizing that goes back down. Local organizing, it really, local matters. Again, Mary mentioned that, you know, I was the first to talk about think local. I mean, I'm a firm believer in that, and community organizing is super important. Cities in Washtenaw County, they vote Democratic. That's great. You know, that's important. We know that. And larger municipalities have the poor voter turnout. We've got to address that. Again, going down to the local core. And Ann Arbor voting numbers are relatively stagnant. That's something the Ann Arbor Democrats have got to start addressing. We've got to really start talking about that. What does that mean? And then, of course, Ypsilanti and their voter participation in 2020, except for Ward 1. That's it. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. I'm happy to take any questions if anybody has any.
Does anybody have a question? Okay. Gail, you're unmuted. Gail Summerhill.
Hi, I'd like to speak to Ypsilanti and the work that we did in Ypsilanti, giving people, going right to them and giving them information. As far as voter turnout, it was very specific, letting people know that you could vote early, the clerk's office, and there were many people involved in the community with pre-voter registration, with all the things that are on our website. So every single thing you needed to know about registering to vote, as well as the actual ballot. It was very informative, and that could speak to why the numbers in the city of Ypsilanti were increased, because there were a lot of grassroots working to engage people. So, thank you.
Yeah, I've got to say, your the outreach that you did, I thought was just really amazing. I loved your website. I thought that was one of the more brilliant things that you did.
Thank
I
you.
really appreciate your
Especially,
detail.
especially the talking ballot. It helped people to be informed and to know who the elected official, who was running for office, and basic questions, not a canned speech. What is your personal passion, so that people would know and make a more educated decision on the people that they chose to vote for.
Yeah, I think your model is one that we should be looking at. Yeah, absolutely.
We're welcoming the seat at the table with you so that you can maybe take on some of our best practices. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail, for your question. And thank you, Ingrid, for your presentation. We really needed to hear that at this point as we think about the future.